Greetings. I'm Dick Kmetz, and I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went to high school there, Northeast High School, and then went to the University of Pennsylvania that's located in Philadelphia and studied chemical engineering. I graduated in February of 1943. I should have graduated in June, but they stopped some of the courses, and they made the courses go faster. We studied in the summer in order to finish earlier. After that, in 1943, I went to work as a chemical engineer, and up in Indian Orchard, Massachusetts, for the Monsanto Company. And during the war, then we made parts for weapons and radar, sonar, tanks, that sort of thing, airplanes, gliders. And then, but after about 6 or 8 months, quite a few of us young engineers decided that we wanted to go and be in the service like our other friends were, to help oppose Hitler and the Japanese. So that was my opportunity then to, I became a cadet midshipman in the United States Merchant Academy in Long Island, New York, and I spent 3 months there in basic training. And this jacket that you see me wearing here was our drill jacket for lifeboat drills and other drills that were there. And the same thing with the cap that I'm wearing, part of our uniform at the academy. After our basic training, they decided that we would all go in our own different ways, and I was sent down to Panama on a Liberty ship, and there I debarked from the Liberty ship and was assigned to the Little Bighorn, which was a tanker. Now these tankers carried 6 million gallons of oil. They were about two football fields long, about 70 feet wide, 10,000 tons of metal, and when they're filled. And I was assigned to the Little Bighorn. Unfortunately, I had a problem and I had a burst appendix there in Panama. I had some wrong medicines that were given to me by people that weren't too well versed in medicine. And as a result, at 3 o'clock in the morning on about the third day, my whole chest and abdominal cavity was just like a stiff board. And I couldn't drink anything, I couldn't eat anything. So they put me in an ambulance and took me up to the Gorgas Hospital. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, a redheaded surgeon from Georgia operated on me and saved my life. He said that if it had been another 6 or 8 hours, I might have died from the infection of this burst appendix. So I spent 2 weeks recuperating there. The nurse said to me when I went into the operating room, she said, "I'll see you in a little while." And then 2 weeks later, she was the one that we went to dinner in Panama itself, and we enjoyed each other's company during my recuperation. So then I was assigned to a ship called a Bandolier, another tanker, and that tanker went to Curacao near Venezuela and was loaded with oil. So we had maybe 43 people on that ship. My job as a cadet midshipman was to learn as much as I could about all the engineering features of the ship so that I could qualify for a more important job later on. So we left Panama, sailing in the Pacific Ocean. 4 days later, we found out what our destination would be. That was a standard procedure not to tell anybody on the ship what our destination was before we left. So one way or another, nobody would find out where we were going. Because if they did, well, then they could send the Japanese submarines and be in our path. At any rate, we sailed almost directly east to a place called Ulithi. It's a very small island out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There were 200 ships there of all kinds of cruisers and destroyers, battleships, and we delivered our oil to these ships so that they could then go and attack the Philippines. Leyte Gulf was a big battle at that time, which our fleet was able to overcome the Japanese Navy, and that way make sure that all our troops could go ashore there in Leyte Gulf and begin to take the Philippines back from the Japanese. So after we gave our oil to the ships at Ulithi, we went to New Guinea and to a place called Manus Island. Now the Marines had just finished going ashore on Guadalcanal and New Guinea and driving the Japanese to the west up along the Solomon Islands. So that we were able to go ashore there. The Seabees Construction Battalion had built all the facilities there, and that's where the men stayed. A lot of the work was done by some people call what we called and everybody called the fuzzy wuzzies. They were shorter stature natives there, dark-skinned natives, with purple, green, and orange hair. That seemed to be something that was part of their appearance. And they were quite helpful in helping us to load our ship with all the different things that we needed to continue our journey. And these places were just loaded with all kinds of foods, not very much fresh vegetables, but all kinds of other foods, like Spam and salads and potato salad and things like that, canned foods. So after we finished loading our ship there, we went and drove around. Our ship made its way around New Guinea to the south, and we focused our attention going between New Guinea and Australia. You see, Australia was about the only place in the Pacific that the Japanese hadn't conquered after they overcame much of the whole area over there. And that included the Philippines and Malaysia and parts of the islands near Indonesia, and of course Guam and everything but midway in the Hawaiian Islands, even some of the Aleutian Islands. So at any rate, we went under New Guinea there, and we sailed about 2 weeks, about 16 miles an hour. That's what about our ship does. That's the fastest the ship went, over to the Persian Gulf. The waters were nice and calm, thankfully, and we just hoped each day that we'd get further and further and over to our destination. So we went up the Persian Gulf and came to a place called Bahrain. Bahrain Island is a small island off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It's served by Saudi Arabians, and the pipes from the oil wells in Saudi Arabia come under the water, maybe a mile or two out to the island, and then they're connected to hoses. And the Saudi Arabians took these hoses and lifted them up, a lot of manual work, up to our ship, and they were attached to our pipelines. And then they would pump the oil through these, the Saudi Arabians would pump the oil through these hoses into the compartments on our ship, the various compartments. They were quite helpful, and we would see them 3 times a day, stop whatever they were doing, and then kneel down and face Mecca and bow and say some prayers, which was kind of interesting to me, who had never seen anything of Islam and what it was like. So, so after we finished, it was hot there. It's maybe around 100, 110 degrees a lot of the Saudi Arabians that maybe came on board our ship were dressed in like blanket white sheets. And because it was so hot, most of us didn't wear much of any kind of uniforms to speak of. So then our ship left the Bahrain Island, and we went down and we stopped at Bombay, India, because 2 or 3 of our major heat exchangers in the engine room began to develop leaks and had problems. So we stopped in Bombay, and 2 or 3 dozen people came aboard, Indians, and they unbolted the heat exchangers and tied all kinds of cordage around them and carried these heat exchangers up the flights of ladders. Our engine room has about 5 ladders that goes up from the deck of the engine room up to the deck of the final deck of the top of the ship. And they carried these heat exchangers up, more or less just physically pulling them up with all these ropes attached to them. They don't have the engineering type materials. They don't have the kinds of motors or slings or whatever that we have, and we're accustomed to in the United States. So anyway, they took them ashore and worked on them and repaired them. And while we were there, we went ashore, and we got to see what it was like to be an Indian living in Bombay. People making 30 to 60 cents a day. A lot of them sleeping on mats on the street overnight, and a lot of them being bossed around by the English, who were the policemen and the directors of all activities, because at that time they were ruling India. And we bought a monkey there, a monkey to take aboard our ship, which just for kind of something, a pet that we could enjoy, and because it is kind of boring day after day doing the same thing. You could watch dolphins on the bow of your ship diving in the waves, and you could do some exercises, but there wasn't too much to do, maybe some reading. So we left Bombay and we went to the Philippines, and we had to go down more toward the south, towards Indonesia. We couldn't go up around Malaysia and in Singapore, because the Japanese still held that part of Asia at that time. So we went down south more, and then we went up through the islands there near Indonesia, and we had to have a pilot to take us up between these islands, and also to make sure that our ship did not hit mines. Now, mines are sort of a sphere about maybe 2-3 feet in diameter, loaded with explosives, and a lot of little tiny pinpoint things that stick out of the mine that are sensitive to touch, and if that hits your ship, it'll blow a huge hole in the side of your ship, and depending on where it hits your ship could be sunk. So the idea was to keep away from these mines, and also to try to avoid any Japanese submarines. The closest ones we came to was a Japanese submarine about 4 hours away. And that was quite helpful, because some of our tankers that had been hit by torpedoes, the oil leaked out, and the oil became ablaze, and the tankers sank, and it was really a problem for everybody on board to maintain their life. So at any rate, we went up there to the Philippines, to Manila, and in the harbor were all kinds of sunken ships, and the harbor itself was just blasted. All the buildings were shattered to varying degrees, and because the Americans had just been there to take Manila away from the Japanese, drive them out of there. So we delivered our oil to a hospital ship and some other ships there, and our captain said he didn't want the monkey on board our ship anymore. The monkey was beginning to cause problems. He was upsetting paint cans and getting in cabins and creating a lot of trouble. So we gave the monkey to the people on the hospital ship, who were very glad to have it. And in turn, they gave us 3 records by the Mills Brothers. I'm gonna buy a paper doll that I can call my own. That was one. Till Then and Cool Water. If you knew by the Mills brothers. It was great numbers. And they gave us a little record player, and that was the music that we that we heard for many months thereafter in our cabin. I was in a cabin with another man called Juice. He was the electrician. We had 2 portholes about 10 inches in diameter, and great bread in the morning that the chefs made. Food was pretty good, except it was mostly spam and things like that. Well, not much in the way of vegetables or fruits. So after we finished in the Philippines, we went back to the Persian Gulf to pick up more oil. This time we went to a place called Abadan, Iran. Abadan is a city there, and maybe, I don't know, 10,000 people. Our tanker pulled up there, and we were told to, and the same thing happened. The native Iranians hooked up the hoses, and again, the English were involved with testing the oil and directing the activities. One of the English people took us out to his apartment, a very small apartment in Abadan, which was quite interesting. There's only like 2 rooms. He wasn't too happy with the Queen for some reason. I think it was because he wasn't getting to go back to England for quite a while. But anyway, we picked up our 6 million gallons of oil in Abadan. Again, people were mostly walking around in light clothes, and we were able to take sheets ashore, and they were quite anxious to have them, and then they would give us things in return. So after we left Abadan, Iran, we went to through the Red Sea. That's over near Egypt, Somalia. We went up through Aden, the Red Sea, and we went through into the Mediterranean Sea. That was kind of interesting because many of those people wanted to sell us things, and they expected. We even bought oranges from some of the people there in that area, Sinai desert area. But we even got money back. If you give them $100 for something, they were used to the idea of kicking back $10 to you because you were the one that ordered the goods from them. That was kind of their normal way to do things. But at any rate, we went through the Red Sea and we saw quite a few of the people that lived on the shores on the Egypt side and on the Sinai desert side. Into the Mediterranean, and then up to Marseille, France, where we delivered the oil that we had gotten in Iran. That was kind of interesting in Marseille because we were parked, our ship was anchored about 5 miles away from Marseille proper. So we had to take cabs, or maybe even privates in the army there would give us a lift into Marseille so that we could enjoy a little time ashore, and that's quite interesting. The French were quite helpful. They let us sleep in the taxi cabs overnight. They let us sleep in the train overnight as long as we got off at 5 o'clock in the morning before the train went from Marseille northward. So it was an enjoyable experience. Let's see, we got. Cigarettes were worth a lot of money there. We could sell cigarettes for about 9 francs. Maybe that's like $2 or $3, something like that. And so we didn't need to really take out any money in French money because we could get our money from selling things that the French needed. So we went from France, we boarded our ship again and went back to the United States. Went first to Houston, and then we went up to Baltimore. And it was at this point that I was able to request and get an agreement to take an examination which would let me become an engineering officer on the ship instead of a cadet midshipman. I passed that test because, of course, I had a lot of engineering training when I was in college, when I was learning how to be a chemical engineer. And I'd had the experience on the ship as a cadet midshipman, so I knew a lot about the ship at that time. And I'd made drawings that I was expected to do. So then I was an engineering cadet, but I still stayed on the Bandolier, which was this tanker, the same tanker that I had been assigned to right when I first started down in Panama. So we went down and picked up some oil in maybe Aruba, which is another little island off of Venezuela where Venezuelan oil goes for refining. And we went from there through the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was just big enough for a ship of our size with about maybe 5 feet to spare on each side in the various locks to get through. So we went through the Panama Canal, and this time we were headed for New Zealand, Wellington, New Zealand. It took us another 2 or 3 weeks to get there. And fortunately, we were able to buy fruits and things like pineapples and different fruits down there in Panama, which was really great when we were out at sea. So we went to New Zealand, to Wellington, and that was quite interesting to meet those people down there. It was like going back 20 years to what life was like in the United States, because they had like old-time trolley cars. And they had not very much in the way of restaurants, maybe just a small restaurant here or there. And the homes were kind of like looked like older homes that we had here in the United States. The people were just great there. They were all friendly. We went and had dinner with them, and they were just loved us there. And so it was a great experience seeing those people down there in Wellington, New Zealand. From New Zealand, we got on our ship. By the way, 3 of our cooks jumped ship, so we had to pick up 3 New Zealand cooks, but that was really great because they could make the best muffins and the best bread you ever heard of in your life. Get up at 3 in the morning and do that. So anyway, we went this time across under Australia, what they call the Australian Bight, that's under Australia. We ran into a very hard, great storm there. And the waves were like 50 to 100 feet high. The ship was going, the bow of the ship was plowing into these waves, creating great waves that came over, some on the ship and some to the side of the ship. We only made maybe like 6 miles a day, not 6 miles an hour instead of 18 or 16 because of the terrible currents and everything. But at any rate, after a few days, the storm abated and we were able to go back up to the Persian Gulf again. This time we went to a place called Bandar Mashur, which gets its oil from Iraq. And it was kind of interesting because we went up this river. I mean, they have the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. We went up there, and there was water as far as the eye could see, just about, in all directions. We pulled up, dropped anchor, tied down our dock points, and then we slept that night. And the next morning we woke up, and all the water was gone except for maybe 200 feet on each side of our ship, which was the river that we were on. It was the most amazing thing to see in your life. So at any rate, we were there in Bandar Mashur, and we saw more about what the life was like for those people over there. I mean, you know, they have little houses along the shore, and these houses maybe are along a little stream. And each person washes his clothes in that little stream, and then the person, of course, that's downstream, they're washing their clothes in the dirty water from the houses up above. And there's no facilities in these little huts. I mean, you know, outhouses are out somewhere else. So it gave you a feeling for what kind of life was like in those days for Arabs at any rate. I think it's much better now, particularly in places like Kuwait and Qatar, and maybe Saudi Arabia too, because of the great wealth that's come to them and the fact that they're now running their own countries instead of England and France running their countries like they did then. So we filled up with our oil and Bandermasher, and this time our ship was able to go to up north more around Singapore because the Japanese had been driven out of all those islands along there, Malaysia and Singapore and all the islands below near Indonesia. So we went across. It took us less time to get up to the Philippines, and we went to the Philippines again to deliver the oil. By that time, a lot of things had been rehabilitated. We went ashore. We went to a great Red Cross service place where they treated us well, where they had places you could rest and you could have some kind of light food with them and just get a nice change of pace. Of course, there were many servicemen there riding around all kinds of jeeps and semi-armored vehicles, but in general, the place was getting back into shape again, and that worked out well. It was working out well for the Filipinos. So by this time, of course, the war with Japan was just about over, and dropping the atom bomb on Hiroshima. So we were able to go across the Pacific all the way towards San Francisco. But then when we got almost over to San Francisco, they said there were just too many ships there. We couldn't stop there. So they sent us over to Hawaii for a while. And we went over there, and that was a joy. I met some fellow people at one of my best friends in college I met there. He had been on an SST, which is a kind of a landing type vehicle that the Army used to land troops in the Pacific. Unfortunately, his SST was hit by a kamikaze plane, and front part of it was just blown away, and the back part that he was on, he was blown into the water. And when he was picked up, they took him back to Hawaii, and he was kind of recuperating there. And he was in charge of part of one of the Army and Navy resting places there. A place called Kailua, which is on the other side of the island from Honolulu. Interesting place. So after we were there a couple weeks and had a chance to rest ourselves and enjoy the beaches, we went through the Panama Canal again and came up the East Coast to New York. And then I had to spend a little while longer to go to Puerto Rico to pick up, I think it was like 25,000 bags of sugar. The United States at that time was rationing sugar. And so to finish off my last 2 months in the service, I went down there and we picked up the sugar in Ponce, San Juan, and Mayaguez. Interesting places in Puerto Rico. Then I came back and finished off. So in all this time, I had been exposed to a lot of different cultures. I'd been exposed to the Islam, the Hindu culture. The Hindu culture in Bombay was quite interesting. The way that their faith was lived out in their lives, the way they even had to have special red spots on their forehead if you were of a certain caste. Cows were very sacred. Cows would walk in stores and anything unimpeded, they were just sacred all over the place. And of course, the mosques there are huge, huge places. The difference, at that time anyway, I think it's improving now, between the very rich and the very poor was just fantastic. It's hard to believe. So it was something to learn. Oh, also I learned in India that racism doesn't have to have something to do with the color of your skin. They have dark-skinned people in India, and the ones that come from Africa are totally separated from the ones that are from India. And they can't go in the restrooms, they can't go in the restaurants, they have to go in special places for even drinking water. So this business of racism, you can have a cultural racism without actually it doesn't have to necessarily be affected by the color of your skin. I suppose we realize that as we look all over the whole world. But it was quite interesting to go to all these places and see people of all different beliefs that lived in all different kinds of ways, and many of them in much poorer ways. I was so happy to get back to the United States, where we had basic things like hot water and refrigerators, things like this that I had kind of taken for granted all my life. That was wonderful. After the war, after I finished my tour of duty on the Bandolier and another ship called the Victory ship, the one that brought sugar back from Puerto Rico, I went back to work for Monsanto, and I think my experience in the service did help me in understanding the values of people and being more considerate and appreciating what people did with you and maybe for you. And one of our biggest jobs was to bring about the beginnings of all the great plastics that we're familiar with today. They all were, many of them were researched and developed during the war. Polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, kind of a resinine, which is a surface coating for cars and refrigerators. That's a phenol, that's a urea and melamine formaldehyde. And there was another one, Resinox. Resinox was a phenol formaldehyde. That was a great thing for making like Formica and this kind of thing. And and then of course we put up a new modern safety glass plastic. So it was just an explosion of people. It went from 500 to 3,300 people, and it was a great demand for engineers and for people to service these new products. So that was where I ended up after I came back. I might also mention that, as I think many people know, after the war was over, we went to great extent to help the Japanese and German people to rebuild their country. And I think that really has worked out fantastically, because they're two of our best friends today, in a sense that they worked with us economically in other ways since that time, since the time of the end of the war. We didn't maintain any kind of a hatred between each other, that kind of thing. It worked out really well. So I think that's about the end of my story. I lost some friends in the war. Some of them were great people. One was a young man that I was in my cabin in a YMCA camp in the summer, and he was a great young man. He was killed, and some of the other people, my fraternity, 5 or 6 people, were killed, people that I knew. But fortunately, we didn't have Hitler in our country, or the Japanese telling us what to do. It might be interesting to know what the nature of persons, when I was like an engineering officer on board my tanker, what we had like a deck crew and an engine crew. The deck crew was responsible for steering the ship, maintaining all the deck part of the ship, that it would be painting the ship from fore to aft, loading cargo, and whatever the captain needed to be done up there in terms of taking a sight on where you were at noon to figure out exactly where you were, this kind of thing. And then the other group was the engine room people, and that was the group that I was responsible for. And my job was to run the engine room from 8 to 12, both morning and night. That meant that I went down in the engine room, which is about 5 stories down on ladders below the deck, the top deck of the ship. And a tanker sits well in the water anyway, so I was well below the water line when I was down there. And that's where we had the boilers that generated this steam, 600 pounds per square inch steam. And that steam ran everything on board. It ran all the turbines and the turbines in turn generated the great big, we had a huge motor. It was like 20, 30 feet in diameter. It had about 36 poles on it. And that motor was the thing that drove the propellers on the ship that gave it the propulsion, 90 RPM propellers. So we also generated, we had electrical generators. We generated electricity, I think it was about 1,000 volts and 1,000 amps. And this electricity now, that was used to run everything on board the whole ship, no matter what it was. It could be the steering thing up in where the captain was, all the lights, all the electrical things, everything that was electrical came from the pumps that pumped the water, everything. The pumps that pumped the water into the boilers, the pumps that pumped the water up to showers or wherever. And of course the steam was used to heat the water that was used wherever, hot water. So the engine room was something where and it got kind of hot down there, especially when you were down around Singapore, which is like 95, 105 degrees with 95% humidity. They tried to bring air down some shafts to give us a draft, some moving air. And so our job, we had one fireman who took care of the boilers, and then we had another person that took care of lubricating all the different moving parts. And then the engineer, that was my job, was to just make sure, hopefully check everything, have logs to fill in what was happening with all the different pieces of equipment. And then we would be responsible for shutting the equipment down or starting it up, say when you were in port or leaving port, that kind of thing, or switching over from one electrical generator to another electrical generator. And like when we were in Bombay and we had to get some of the piece of equipment repaired, we would work with these people that came down into the bowels of the ship there to dismantle them and take them ashore and fix them. And it was kind of interesting sometimes because our chief engineer never wanted to shut the propulsion down while we were going across the Pacific. He wanted to keep moving, which meant that if there was something that needed to be fixed, we had to figure out a way to fix it without the steam moving through these big, huge motors and generators and so forth, and not shutting anything down. So we had to plug tubes in the boiler. We actually at one point, a welding rod jammed one of our valves that was high up in the engine room. And what we did was we created, normally it had about 15 pounds pressure on it. We created a system where we ran just a very slight vacuum on that whole part of the operation, so there wasn't any pressure on that valve. So 3 of our fellows took the valve apart, took the welding rod out, put it back together again, and then we restored the pressure in that line. So but in the meantime, our ship had been moving right along the whole time. And it was quite interesting, so we did that. And that's about the story of what a person who's in charge of the engine room has to do. We had 2 other people that took care of the 4 to 12, and 1 person for that, and then another person for the 12 to 8, and then the chief engineer, the chief engineer could be up in his engine room, and if he heard a difference in sound somewhere, he could tell you to get down, look at the bearing on the feed water pump to the boiler or something. Sure enough, you could see that bearing needed some attention, had a problem. That was quite interesting. He was a person that had only been through the 6th grade, And yet he was blown off an aircraft carrier before he got onto our ship. And they didn't want him to go back to that aircraft carrier because they felt he needed some lighter duty, so they put him on as chief engineer on our ship. He's a very low-key person. When I met him, when I first went on, he was only dressed in his underwear, which was quite interesting. But that shows you sometimes on a tanker type thing, things are much more casual than, say, on a battleship or aircraft carrier. The more we can help people in this world, the less wars we'll have in the future. And even now in Iraq, I think if we can give them food and medicines and water and all the people that aren't in the cities that are being defended by the Republican Guard or whatever it is, give all those other people that are outside those cities as much help as we can, I think it would really make a big difference.